Now let's shift to a specialization called Paleoethnobotany. Paleoethnobotany, or what we sometimes call archaeobotany, involves the recovery and analysis of plant remains from archaeological sites. This is done by sorting, identifying, measuring, drawing, or photographing, and counting the different specimens under a microscope. The macrobotanical remains themselves consist of seeds, grains, pollen, the shells from different nuts, perhaps, other examples of that. What the goal of their research then is to study ancient plant-human interactions and the changes in those interactions over time. And so here we're seeing a few examples of what macrobotanical remains look like under the microscope. Clearly not with the naked eye. You need to be using a binocular microscope to understand the shape and be able to identify the differences among these grains. What these analysts are able to do then is, if they can identify the plant species that are present within an assemblage, we can get an understanding then of what the people were eating or using in terms of wild resources. If we're able to identify different parts of the plant that are present, then we can start to understand a little bit more about how they were using these plants. There are many other things then that ancient plant remains can actually tell us about past societies. The first and most obvious is probably their diet and how they prepare different foods. We're able to explore the origins of domestication and farming in different places around the world. We can determine how plants were used in craft production, so fibers for textiles, gourds that might have been used as containers, reeds for mats or house construction, as well as basketry. We can gain an understanding of how plants were used for fuel. The presence of different pollen in, let's say, in lake deposits or captured within the materials that filled in a room help us to understand past environments, the climate, maybe different resource availability over time, and how humans impacted those shifts. We can determine if a site was occupied seasonally or year-round, depending on the pollen that's present, for example. And we can actually even interpret status and different social relationships among people based on, if there's one household that seems to have access to more meat than others, for example. That might be some sort of status differentiation. Among these specialists, there's debate over what the earliest domesticate actually was, rice or rye grains. Among those, we find samples that date from 9,000 to 8,000 BCE. Today, rice might be a leading candidate, though. It's eaten by 1.7 billion people and accounts for 21% of total calories consumed by humans. So, pretty impressive feat. In this module, I'm going to include a very short video. It talks about the site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is a potential place where domestication might have first occurred. So take a look at that when you're done listening here. But what about plant domestication in the New World, since that is the focus of our course? Well, we already know that by 10,000 BCE, there were foragers occupying nearly all of the Americas. But we know very well nowadays that they adopted what's called a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So these are people who live in small mobile groups that allows them to exploit a variety of resources. They're constantly moving around, following game, looking for the seasonality of different wild plant resources. These people tend to be highly adapted to local conditions. They really understand their environment. And in fact, humans have been hunter-gatherers for most of history. Our ethnographic data helps supplement our understanding then of prehistoric lifeways. Among hunter-gatherers, the hunters do tend to usually be men. What they provide to the community, though, is a relatively small amount of calories. Hunting for large game, for example, it's great when you can bring one in, but you're not always going to bring in a big animal every day. On the other hand, gatherers, who are or were primarily women, provide 75 to 80% of the calories for their community. And in this sense, gathering can also include, small animals, rodents, rabbits, lizards, things of that nature. So in this case, we should actually be calling these communities gatherer-hunter communities, in my opinion. The sort of economic division of labor that we tend to see is one of the only forms of specialized roles within these groups. They tend to enjoy a diverse diet and abundant leisure time, as evident by the photo here on the right. They tend to live in small groups of no more than 250 people, and the tradition is to call them bands, which is a term we will return to later in the semester. They tend to have no accumulated wealth, and their marriage rules are important because it requires them usually to marry outside of their immediate group. And this is important not only from, a biological diversity standpoint, but it also helps to foster relationships with neighbors. So if suddenly you find yourself in a drought situation in your territory, perhaps you can go live with another group temporarily. This can also, if you have shared familiar relations across groups, you might not see as many intergroup hostilities. Now, over time, we have been able to observe archaeologically a transition towards sedentism, or becoming more fixed on the landscape, staying in the same place all year long, as well as cultivation of different plant species. Some of the factors that contributed to this were rising population pressure that would have required new foraging strategies and resources that required wider cooperation among groups. So, for example, salmon runs, following the caribou migrations, or different nut harvests would have required more labor. The development of processing and storage technologies and tools also helped to compensate for periodic food shortages that might have been caused by any types of short-term climatic changes, or, like I said, seasonal fluctuations in resource availability. And one important trend to note is that we actually see some of the earliest, more complex societies, as we call them among hunter-gatherer groups, developing along coastal areas. And researchers associate this with the higher density and diversity of available resources in coastal regions. So, for example, the Chumash in Southern California and the El Cajon shell midden in Mexico. These are very early examples that we can draw information from. Now, plant domestication itself involves important terminology. Cultivation is when humans deliberately encourage the reproduction of a plant species. So, for example, weeding out and helping to grow and encourage the growth of the traits you see that you like in a plant species. Over time, this can actually start to result in morphological changes to the plant itself. This then develops into full-on domestication, and this is what happens when plants under cultivation undergo some sort of genetic changes that are actually the result of human selection or adaptations by the plant due to humans manipulating their environment. At this point, then, the plant has become dependent completely on humans, or at least to a very large degree on humans, for its success. Now, here in the New World, our domesticates include three sisters: maize, beans, and squash, of course. Also chili peppers, amaranth, manioc, potatoes, sunflowers, cacao, peanuts, and quinoa. Among animals, we have the dog, turkey, guinea pig, llama, and alpaca. Teosinte is probably the most famous example when it comes to domestication here in the New World. That is the wild ancestor of maize. So it's been hypothesized that humans favored plants among this species whose seeds scattered less easily when they were ripe. So instead of the plant being able to self-sow itself, it then started hanging on to the seeds more often. And humans liked that because then they could come collect them, use them to propagate new crops for the future. Over time, these favored types that held on to their seeds a bit longer, they started growing closer and closer to campsites. Humans then were able to weed and tend to the plants, and this is what have ultimately contributed to their genetic mutations. And while we're unsure where exactly cultivation took place, the best evidence that we have is in the Tehuacan Valley in Mexico. And so these images on the left then are showing you what the wild plant would have looked like originally and how it sort of transitioned over into the maize we recognize nowadays. Same with the photos that we're seeing here. Some of the earliest sites for plant domestication are all throughout Mexico and Central America. You see them here on the map. As I mentioned, the greatest evidence we have for where cultivation first took place is the Tehuacan Valley in the state of Puebla in Mexico. Here, the first occupants hunted mainly deer and collected wild foods. So around 10,000 BCE, we see that 50 to 60% of their diet was game. However, by 4500 BCE, which is quite a long period of time, but we're seeing this transition, is 90% of their diet actually was plants and grasses by that point in time. Over 24,000 maize specimens have been found in the valley, especially from some of the prominent cave sites. The corn cobs that we see there, they're only about 2 inches, so pretty small still at this point. But what we find is that they lack the ability to disperse their kernels naturally, so this is what we understand to be clear domestication. In this case, the domestication process was a deliberate shift in ecological adaptation. Another famous site is Gilanikits in Oaxaca. This is a cave site that was occupied several times from about 8750 to 6670 BCE. There we have found that occupants foraged about 11 different edible plant species, and we find evidence that they were experimenting with planting beans that eventually expanded into squash and an early maize variety, and you see some of the dates associated with cultivating those species there. So your activity then is to investigate a bit further New World domesticates within the Tehuacan Valley. And so what I've provided you with is an occupational sequence for the Tehuacan Valley. So population information, settlement pattern information, but also the dates we have for the cultivation and domestication of different species. So you need to review that information carefully and then do your best to answer the questions.